Yes, I'm at Champlain Towers. Something's going on here. You got to get us out of here.
As new evidence emerges of possible warning signs as early as 1996.
Hi everybody, Dave Rauch here, and welcome to a very special edition of The Maintenance Manager. And I'm joined here today by Scott Stewart, who is the Community Association Manager for Champlain Towers South when it collapsed. We're going to be going over Scott's story first, and we're also going to discuss the aftermath, what happened after the collapse, and then we're most importantly going to go over how to prevent this from happening again in honor of all those who perished and all those that survived that have trauma and all those that are trying to make this situation better going forward. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you very much, Scott, for being here.
Thanks for having me and getting the story out.
Excellent.
Appreciate it.
Excellent. So let's start off. And Scott, again, welcome to the Maintenance Manager newsletter here today. And why don't we start off with telling us a little bit about your background and how you ended up at Champlain Towers South. And I think it was about a year and a half ago, wasn't it?
Well, it was a year and a half before the collapse, yes.
Okay, year and a half. So that would be
3.5 years ago.
3.5 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, I started out in the hospitality industry.
Mm-hmm.
In Florida, a lot of the developers were starting to go into fractional rentals or condo hotels. And to be able to be the management, you actually had to be CAM'd or licensed in the state of Florida.
And CAM is a designation from CAI.
Actually, in Florida, it's also a CAM. It's a Community Association Manager license.
Okay.
So I got that, and from there I actually went helped some developers down in the Keys establish some different things, condo hotels, and then went to work for a company here in Miami, a large management firm at the time that was very small, and moved my way up to become a district manager with them. Helped establish their high-rise division and also some of their properties in the Bahamas.
Great. So you had high-rise experience before Champlain Towers South.
Yes.
And because I read on the resume that you actually established that division for them, like you mentioned.
Yes.
And high-rises are a tough animal.
Yes, but they're a lot of fun.
Yes. And as we discussed last night, a high-rise is really like a ship turned up on its end, because all the systems in a high-rise are self-contained.
Yes.
And maintaining those systems takes an extra level of expertise. So,
and people forget that the building is actually a living being.
Yeah.
You know, it breathes. It has a pulse. People forget that.
Yep. And it's a community.
Yes.
In and of itself. So it's a very interesting entity. Scott, take us back for a minute to when you first got to Champlain Towers South. When you took the job, you first got there and you were getting to know the building. How long did it take for you to get to know the building? Was it physically in a lot worse shape than other buildings that you had managed or seen?
No. When a manager comes into the building, you're building a relationship with that building. Everyone thinks that, you can walk into any building, it's exactly the same. No two buildings are the same.
Absolutely not.
Unfortunately, records aren't kept over the years. As managers change, as boards change, as management companies change, records disappear, which is very sad. To actually get to know a building, it takes about 6 months to a year. There's a lot of work involved in it. Again, we were fortunate because we were able to find records. Took a lot of time, and we digitized as much as possible.
Got you. But the developer didn't set aside a set of blueprints or engineering drawings or anything. You had the condo plan and the CC&Rs.
We actually had to go to the county to pull a lot of the blueprints for the building. And even those weren't up to date. They weren't as-built.
They weren't the as-built. In other words, the changes made as the building was built. Take us back, though. How bad was Surfside? Was it an unusually bad situation in terms of the deterioration, in terms of the deferred maintenance, or was it similar to other buildings? Was it better, worse?
Visually, from what I could see, I've been in a lot worse buildings that I was actually surprised were standing. This looked more cosmetic. You know, there were some issues that need to be dealt with, but every 40-year-old building has it.
Right.
So it's totally unexpected.
What do you think went wrong with Champlain Towers South in terms of the board dynamics? And, or maybe you can tell us from the beginning when you first got involved with the consultant's report, Morbido's report on I believe it was the rebar that was expanding, causing the concrete to spall.
The 2018 report was actually put in place before I actually started working for the building. I was not aware of it at the time I took the position. I was actually in kind of semi-retirement, and I went to work for them as a favor. I like buildings, especially high rises, the renovation, and I see too many people getting messed over. You know, things being done that shouldn't be done, that type of thing. What I could find from their records is they would always go with the most economical way of doing things, but not always the best way of doing things. That's what we're trying to fix 40 years of
Yeah.
lack of maintenance.
Yeah, and it was 40 years.
Yes.
And so I'm assuming it wasn't just the concrete spalling and the rebar expanding. There were a lot of other issues that you first encountered when you first started at the community.
Yes, we had electrical issues, fire code violations, a lot of different issues.
Yeah, and of course there's uh, the water ponding on the pool deck, which to me was a real big red flag.
Yes.
And then you also showed us the pictures of the planter that had the cracking in it. So
Yes.
there were a lot of things going on.
Yes, we also had ponding on the roof. Yeah, there was a lot of issues.
Right. So was there anything that made it difficult to address these issues for you with the board or then with the board with the homeowners? So how did that go? Give us a sense of how the board meetings went and how did it go with trying to explain to the board and then the homeowners that they had all these things that they needed to do?
It was actually rather interesting. I was hired in by one board, which turned over, they elected a new board, which we do every year here in Florida. The old board, again, wanted to try to get costs down as much as possible. The incoming board is, look, we need to get this done and it needs to be done right. They were very cooperative and they wanted to get everything done and try to do it the right way. The homeowners, of course, everyone in the building becomes an expert. So there was a lot of pushback. We tried educational courses continuously with presentations, PowerPoints. We were having pseudo board meetings at least twice a week.
Really?
Yes.
You say pseudo board meetings.
They weren't technically board meetings. They were informational meetings. Every board meeting, residents would show up and be demanding that they be part of the process. Well, again, what they're trying to do is actually get the bids lower by going out to their friends, which, again, we don't do that. Under my regime, we don't do that. We do blind bidding. Everybody gets the same specifications, and they have to blind bid through, and everything's open at a board. But we would get a lot of pushback because of cost. When they bought into the units, a lot of them had been there for the whole 40 years. They bought from the developer, and they didn't understand that you pay a little now or you pay a lot more later. And that's what happened. Over the years, they tried to keep the maintenance down as low as possible. They would constantly waive their reserves, and at some point it comes time to pay the piper. We offered actually to give tours to the residents to show them,
Mm.
the different things that we're talking about so they could actually visibly see it. We had pictures up on the website every meeting. We tried to give as much information as possible.
Wow. And were the consultants there? Was Morabito there? Who was helping you educate the homeowners on what needed to be done?
Morabito
And
actually prepared a couple of the presentations, but most of the work, believe it or not, was a cooperation between the board president and myself. We would go through line by line on everything on the reports and put it into a PowerPoint and try to make it so that the average person could understand it
Mhm.
between language barriers and as non-technical as possible.
And you say most of the homeowners there were elderly.
Hmm.
And when we say elderly, do we mean 70, 80s in that age range?
We had between 60 and 80 was probably the majority of the building. And again, they did not expect to live that long.
Right.
When they bought into the building, the average life expectancy was maybe 60.
Mhm.
Now they're in their 70s and 80s. They couldn't afford it. And when you've lived someplace that long, it is your home. You've seen your kids grow up there and visiting, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of emotion attached to it. But at some point, you have to realize maybe I need to move on to a retirement facility. And a lot of them could not do that mentally.
And also, they couldn't afford to.
They'd have to sell their unit to be able to.
I see.
And that's not what they did not want to do. They wanted to give it to their children.
Mhm.
So again, very much an emotional roller coaster.
Jeez. How did you and the board deal with all these emotions? I mean, it sounded like you had a lot of meetings.
We had a lot of
And you
meetings.
had to deal with a lot of emotions.
Yes.
And a lot of pushback.
The nice thing about if a manager really gets involved in the building, it becomes like an extended family.
Mhm.
I wish I could say every day was roses and everything else, but it wasn't. There were days that I would find myself arguing with residents because they were misinformed, or, oh, my friend down the road told me this, and they were convinced that was the truth,
Mm.
even though it had no point in truth whatsoever. Um, but again, something were if something were to happen, we would be the first ones there for them. So it was like a giant family,
Mhm.
and eventually most people came to accept it. That these are the repairs that need to be done.
Let's could we talk a minute about the board of directors itself? I
Yeah.
think there was a very committed and involved board president.
Yes.
I do believe I read her letter
Yes.
to the membership, which was a good letter.
Yes. Jean was fantastic.
Right. How about the rest of the board? Was the entire board supportive of the work that was about to take place and the way that it was being presented to the homeowners?
Yes. Of course, there were a couple that would ask questions, and again, thought it could be done cheaper or other ways.
Mhm.
They were always listened to, and they were always more informed. And that was, again, part of the point was making sure people were informed. So they always would, we would argue behind the scenes,
Mhm.
but try to present a united front.
Mhm. And I do recall that originally, and I may be wrong in this, and I'd love to know, originally the repairs from the first consultant's report, I think I had heard were $3 million.
Well,
And then it had ballooned by 2018, around the time you came in,
Mhm.
to 9 million. Are those numbers about correct?
Sounds about right, yes.
Okay.
Keeping in mind that the way that people inspect a building is different than the way that a building needs to be
Mm.
inspected by an engineer. When they're hired, there's no standard RFP to hire an engineer.
Mhm.
So each one will come up with an idea and then every board wants them to cut back, and try to save money.
Right.
So instead of doing 100% inspection, they'll do a percentage inspection
Right,
and try to
right.
extrapolate from that.
Mhm.
And that's what happened. The first survey that they did, I believe they did like a 10% inspection.
Mm-hmm.
The 2018, they did like a 30 or 40% inspection.
Right. And that's about the time you started at the community.
Yeah, right after that, and then we did 100% inspection.
And that was in 2020, 2 years after the,
Correct.
and in the 100% inspection, the full inspection, I think the cost went up from 9 million to 16 million or 15 million.
We're from about 8 million up to 15 million
Yeah, so
and some change.
I'm assuming if they had, they could have made the repairs at the time you arrived or earlier, it might have been 3 to 5 million. But it certainly
doubt that.
Yeah, it was probably
Again,
more.
most people try to cut cost,
Mhm.
and the only thing they're doing by doing that is hurting themselves. I don't like change orders.
Mhm.
Change orders are too costly. Because basically you have a contractor on site, now they can charge you whatever they want.
Yeah, well, again, that's the big problem with working on condominiums is that you can't see what's inside the structure
Correct.
until you get in there.
Yes.
And so unfortunately, change orders are almost common practice.
Yes.
Um,
Well, like I said, we try to investigate everything possible.
mhm.
Like one example would be in the lobby. It had a porte-cochere that actually covered the outside entry where the cars would come in at and all that. There was no firewall between the inside of the building and the outside of the building.
Really?
Yeah. So all that exhaust from the cars was coming into the building.
Oh, boy.
To me, that's dangerous.
Mhm.
But unless we actually had, if we had stayed with the original inspections, it would never been caught.
I see. So that was caught in the 100% inspection.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Because we were looking at the impact windows, and we had to make sure that we had the support for it. Well, it was tied in with the windows that were there were stucco and gypsum.
Gotcha.
No, you can't do that.
So the 100% inspection report included not just the spalling concrete and the rusting rebar, the structural issues, but it also included windows, doors, firewalls.
Well, that's what a lot of people don't understand. Windows are part of the structure.
Absolutely.
Paint is part of a structure.
Mhm.
Each component of the structure has something to help it, and it's all important. They all tie together. Windows that are leaking, if they're not sealed and caulked or put in new and still sealed and caulked properly, you now have an exposed envelope, which causes accelerated deterioration of the building.
Water is what actually destroys most all building components. Of course, there's also sun
Mm-hmm.
and the effects of radiation, solar radiation. So, but water's the chief destroyer. And you're down here in Florida. I know in California, we only get 12 inches a year, except for this year. We're getting, maybe
Insane
50
amount,
inches
yes.
this year. But here in Florida, you probably get 100 inches a year
Yes.
of rain. But you also have the moist salt air that comes in too, and salt, when it gets into the air, is corrosive.
Very.
Sodium chloride. So you've got a double whammy there with not just a tremendous amount of water, but you've got salt air too.
That and the fact that we are in the Everglades. The land that this building is sitting on that we're in right now, this used to be marshland,
Ah.
and it was drained. So now put on top of that the humidity and decomposing matter under the ground.
Right. Yeah, and I was actually remarking earlier, because there's a lot of construction work around the hotel here.
Yes.
There's a building site right across the way, and the water table must be just 10, 20 feet below the grade.
Some areas not even that.
Yeah, so how do you get the pilings down to bedrock?
We don't have bedrock.
Yeah, that's
part
so
of the
you have
problem.
floating foundations. Yeah.
Basically, yeah. We actually have limestone.
Uh-huh.
So you're trying to go down to the limestone table and go down,
Mhm.
whatever's been calculated. But again, limestone deteriorates.
Yeah.
And sometimes,
Interesting.
like with Champlain Towers, the water table would actually go above the floor of the garage level.
Jeez.
So, if they get water in the garage, what they do is they'll put holes in the concrete to let the water seep out.
Ah.
Well, no, now you've
No.
destroyed part of the barrier, and it allows the water in.
Jeez. That is something else. Um, Let me return real quick to the 100% report,
hmm
inspection report. Um, when you presented that, you and the board presented it to the homeowners. Um, did they begin to understand the gravity of the situation, the magnitude of the problems they had on their hands, and did that make everything a lot harder because they were realizing they had to actually do this work?
At first, no. Everyone thought the numbers were just inflated.
Mm,
Um, Everyone thought, oh, you're just going to take our money. Wasn't the case.
mhm.
Then people started to slowly realize what was actually going on. We actually had stucco coming off the building.
Right.
Well, in the past, what they would do is they would allow it to fall off and then they would paint over it,
Mhm.
hiding it. I would not paint it. I left it so that they could actually see the scars.
Mhm.
And look, this is what's happening. You need to actually be aware.
Mhm.
People paint the garage ceilings all the time, and in the subterranean garages. That's great, but what you're doing is you're hiding cracks. So cosmetic is great, but you're also hiding a lot of things.
Well, let me ask this too. The $16 million, 15, $16 million number that I've read about in the various journals, um, that wasn't a hard number, was it? Was
No.
that a number from actual bid
For
from the
bid.
contractors?
Yes.
Oh, it was a
It was
bid from
a
contractors.
budgetary number.
Oh,
It
okay,
was
so
not disclosed prior.
it was a budgetary number from the inspection report, the
Correct.
Morabito. I got you. So
Yes.
it wasn't actually a hard number.
No, nothing's
So-
hard until it's done.
So when that work went out to bid, it could actually have been $20 million worth
Yes.
of work or more
Or less.
or less. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, you can only guesstimate so much.
Right.
Keep in mind that also included electrical upgrades required and other items, not just concrete.
Mhm.
But when you have a pool deck that's that large, and you're talking not only a structural deck that needs to be repaired or replaced, as well as a topper deck, it's a lot of concrete.
Right. And actually, you told me that there were 3 layers of tile over top of that pool deck in some areas.
Yes,
Causing a lot of weight and stress.
a lot of weight that it was never designed for.
Right, and I don't know much about the site, but in my opinion, I think, and from what I've read, it was the collapse of the pool deck that happened first.
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah. And that could have, and you told me that when the pool deck collapsed, it ruptured a water main,
Correct.
and the water main started spilling into the garage level of the building.
Yep.
Which I think, obviously we've got a wait still for the final report to come out from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
But in my opinion, it was that pool deck that wasn't sloped properly
Mm-hmm.
so that the water would run off that probably was the biggest problem that the association faced.
A few things.
One of the biggest
Yeah,
problems.
that definitely was contributed because originally there was no membrane, no waterproofing. When they had put in the pavers one of the times, apparently they put in some cheap membrane. Again, weight and the fact that one of the structural beams was missing.
Mm-hmm.
They crowded in a rebar in the columns, undersized columns. There's a lot of contributing factors.
Yeah.
The building next door, they built a massive building next door. They were within 20 feet of the property putting in sheet piles, which basically are, a lot of people don't know what sheet piles are, but they're basically
They called seat piles,
sheet piles.
sheep piles,
Sheet.
piles.
Yes.
Gotcha.
It's basically a 1 inch piece of steel
Hmm.
that you pound into the ground. That's usually about 50 feet long, and you pound about 10 to 20 to 30 feet, depending upon how much you need to help keep the water out of your construction site. Well, these are pounded into the ground.
Right.
There's different standards for vibration.
Mhm.
Florida actually uses one for the roads, which is considered acceptable. There were quite a few times where they exceeded that
Hmm.
in putting these pilings in. Again, or the sheet piles.
Hmm.
Again, I wasn't there at the time, but my understanding is there was waves on the pool.
When they were doing the work.
Correct.
So yeah, that would cause a lot of vibration to the
Yes.
Champlain Towers South side.
Yes, and there was no active monitoring going on our site.
Mm.
Well, at the time, the building's 30 to 35 years old. It already has stress issues.
Right. Cracking issues,
Yes.
swelling issues with the concrete.
And as you move it more and more, you're going to get more and more crack.
Hmm.
More and more crack means more and more water getting into the rebar.
So while it's very difficult, if not impossible, to say that 87 Park, the building next door that they were building,
Mm-hmm.
that caused
No,
the
you can't.
problem, it didn't help.
It didn't help. And my opinion only, it was a contributing factor,
Mhm.
but not the catalyst.
Mhm.
The building still had a lot of issues. It already had cracks.
Mhm.
But you're from California. Earthquakes.
Oh yeah.
Think about a constant earthquake going on for 2 to 3 months.
Mhm.
It's going to accelerate any cracking that's in any foundation.
Right. Right. And especially since the building was not sitting on bedrock,
Correct.
it probably got onto the sub foundation.
Yes. In Florida, we have very shallow water tables.
Mm.
When we actually opened up the foundation underneath the garage, it was a flowing river of ocean water.
Oh geez.
So again, contributing factors.
Wow.
But again, every piling that was put in was inspected, through LADAR and different methods, to the point where they actually cut out sections of the slab, the structural slab for the garage, and actually went down the pilings just to see if they were lined and all that. Took core samples and very extensive.
That's so interesting.
Keep in mind that through this whole process, we kept pushing the project along.
Mhm.
Besides any objections or any obstacle, we would try to overcome it. The one that we couldn't overcome was COVID. It actually shut down the city almost for 6 months.
Oh, interesting.
We would have been in construction at the time, because we would have already been out in bid and we would have had final bids back and we would have started work. And the first part of the work was removing all the pavers from the pool deck. Because the way we were sequencing the work was that we would do lines at a time and only have to close down the pool deck once. So we'd be making repairs on the building and the pool deck at the same time.
Okay. So take me back. The collapse occurred June of 21,
Correct.
and COVID started in February, March of 20. So a year prior.
Yes.
And so no one has even talked about the effect of COVID on the timetable. So you also said that the board approved the work and was moving forward.
Oh, yes.
You were in the process of getting proposals.
We
bids.
were pushing hard for it. Even during COVID, everyone shut down their offices.
In terms of everyone, you're saying the building department,
Building department, engineers,
Florida Power and Light.
no, that's essential service.
They don't turn the lights out.
They don't turn the lights out.
Okay.
But mentioning that, I mean, at first we couldn't even get to the building as a manager because we weren't considered essential.
Really?
We actually had to get a decree when it was brought out. Okay, so if the water pump goes down and there's no water in the building, are you going to go in and turn it on? Do you know how to?
Interesting.
All of a sudden, we became essential personnel.
And I do know that Florida, as a state, approached COVID differently than many other states.
Yes.
More reasonably, actually. And so during that, when COVID started, how long did it take for operations at the high rise Champlain Towers South to kind of normalize?
It hadn't even normalized before this happened.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So was
We still had a lot of precautions that we had in place.
I see.
But as far as the timeline goes, everybody shut down for 6 months.
So basically, the work on the building, the bid, getting the bids back and actually starting the project might have started
Would
a
have
year
started.
earlier,
Mhm.
half a year earlier, if COVID hadn't hit.
Correct.
God,
We-
that's something I don't think many people will understand.
From the original timeline that we put together, we would have already had pavers off the deck of the pool deck.
Mhm.
So some of these things may have already been discovered.
Jeez.
And we would have been working on the actual the lines of the building, repairing concrete.
Wow. And obviously, if the pavers had been taken off the pool deck, maybe it wouldn't have collapsed. Which
There's a possibility.
precipitated.
We would have seen cracks and damages.
Scott, let's go back to, you were talking about educating the homeowners
Yes.
and on the work that needed to be done. And I think one of the things that I now know that I didn't before is that you and the board of directors, Gene,
Mm-hmm.
and the board, and the consultants possibly,
Yes.
put a tremendous amount of work into PowerPoint presentations. Love to hear a little bit more about those presentations, and you said you had those like every week,
Actually, we had them twice a week.
twice a week.
Yes. That way, if you couldn't attend one, you could attend another. Unfortunately, lack of participation for most people. And some people would say, "Oh, I never knew about it." Well, we sent out e-blast. We had it posted in the mailroom. We had it posted in the elevator.
I see. And might that have been due to the COVID scare?
It was all by Zoom.
It was all by Zoom.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
No excuse.
I see.
It was people not wanting to take the time to invest their time in their home. We also offered to take people on tours.
Mhm.
We would set up at least 1 or 2 tours a week, saying, "Come walk the building with me.
Mhm.
Look at it through my eyes."
Right. But I'm trying to get a sense of the timing here. In other words, you started as the manager in about 2018,
Part-time in 2018, yes,
2018,
in November.
November 2018. So 1920.
Mm-hmm.
So in that 2 year time span, you worked hard to
Yes.
get these, to work with the board to start getting this work going.
Yes.
And you put together PowerPoint presentations, you got together with consultants and the board and pushing this information out.
Writing all the RFPs, going over specifications, everything.
And you felt, I'm assuming that you felt that you were making good progress, that the board felt that they were making good progress in finally getting some of these issues handled, these problems.
We had made more progress in that year and a half than they had in the previous 5.
Tell me how you were feeling at the time.
I was excited.
Yes,
Yes.
so things were moving forward
Very quickly.
very quickly. And by the time that collapse occurred in June of 2021, you had only been there 2 years,
Yes.
plus or minus. So, so this was really, boy, somewhat unfair that this happened on your watch.
Yeah.
You were only there 2 years.
Had to happen to somebody, but yes.
But
This was on top of everyday management duties.
mhm.
Still had to walk the building. You still had to make sure mechanical systems were running. You still had to inspect units that were doing architectural changes in their units. Um, when we came in, the financials were in ruins. Um,
Yeah.
so we had to go through a major audit.
And that's what I've been saying for so long, is that managers, community association managers have so much on their plate,
Mm-hmm.
right? The financials, the audits, the CPA, the landscaping, the reserve studies. I mean, and dealing with the boards, the board meeting packet, the board of directors, the homeowners, the everyday issues. And then to throw on top of that,
Oh,
managing the building.
but you forgot also the municipalities. You know, you have health and welfare checks that happen once a year. You have fire department that comes in and inspects the building. You have the building department, not only from the local level, but from the county level.
Right. And all that, and then on top of all that, you have to oversee the building itself, the
Yes.
physical plan. And typically, most community association managers have an engineer or two. You told me a story, if I can talk about
Yeah.
it, about how you had to show the two guys that you had who they were not EPA certified. They were not really engineers.
No.
They were just two
Not
guys.
at all. They were maintenance guys.
And could they speak English?
Very little.
Okay, but with little English, you were able to teach them how to exercise the water shutoff valves.
Yes.
So you, taking over this building, are showing these guys how to do their job.
Yes.
And then you also told me that they were also doing a lot of work for homeowners.
Yes, which is typical.
That is typical. So
unfortunately, in South Florida, yes.
While they're on the payroll of the HOA.
Yes.
See, that to me is just, it's crazy.
Shouldn't happen, but
So-
it happens in every building. I don't care what people tell me.
Jeez. And then for a lot of our board member viewers, you know, there's a couple ways that this works, and that is that the engineers could be employees of the HOA,
Mm-hmm.
or they can be employees of a company
Yes.
that specializes in engineering, like ABM or
Mm-hmm.
like ProTech Building Services, or they could be an employee of the management company.
Which is more typical.
And that's really kind of the fox watching the hen house,
Yes.
in my opinion, but that's a whole nother subject.
Yes.
But to me, when I heard that you were explaining to these guys how to exercise the water shutoffs, and I think you said you came up with a schedule of mechanical equipment inspections for them.
Yes, we're actually trying to put together maintenance manuals for a lot of equipment that was obsolete.
Yeah, jeez.
Well, you're right. A lot of people don't understand how much is involved because they don't see it.
And I think the most important thing, again, is to understand that you're taking care of all of the people side of the business, the
Yes.
business side of the business, the board meetings, the financials, the reporting requirements, all this stuff. And then as to manage the building, the facility, the physical plant itself. Yeah. I wanted to show this to you. This is the breaking point. This was produced in 2018
Mm-hmm.
by CAI National, by the Foundation of Community Association Research. And this is Breaking Point Examining Aging Infrastructure in Community Associations, which was, you know, it was an excellent report.
Yes, it was.
And so I just want to call this to your attention, which I thought is kind of the key. In postponing inspections, reserve studies, and ultimately completing repairs or renovations, boards often end up facing an exponentially more comprehensive and expensive project in the long run.
Yep.
And by just delaying because of COVID for a year, it caused a tremendous tragedy,
Loss,
obviously. But this is the thing that boards of directors need to understand. Now, we know, we've
Mhm.
both been dealing with boards for 30, 40 years, that they're not trained as board members. They're just normal people that take this position voluntarily. But they don't understand
Mm-hmm.
that if you don't fix something immediately when you see it, that if you wait a year, 5 years, 10 years, it's not a doubling of cost.
No.
it's an exponential increase in cost to a factor of sometimes 100.
Oh, easily.
So that's one of the greatest challenges that you as community managers face
Mm-hmm.
in explaining this to boards.
And getting to understand that you need to not kick the can down the road anymore.
Yep.
They're either going to pay a little now or a lot more later.
Yep. It's cliche-ish,
Yes.
but it's so, so true. Sad in this case.
Well, that's a lot of people forget that these weren't just residents to me. A lot of these people were friends.
Mhm.
So I mean, I lost a lot of good people,
Yeah,
and it's still hard.
it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, and that's why I know that, I appreciate you being here, helping us to educate boards of directors
That's the most
on
important thing.
what needs to be done to prevent this from happening again.
Trying to get people to understand.
Exactly, and we're going to get to that next. Can you tell us, kind of take us back to what happened that night? Who called you? When did you show up? What time? What'd you see?
Sorry, I might get a little emotional. I'll warn
That's
you.
okay. That's fine.
I got the call probably about 5 or 10 minutes after the actual
Mhm.
collapse happened.
Mhm.
The call that I got, the pool had collapsed. There's
Who
water
called you?
everywhere. The president of the association.
President.
Because she did live on site.
Mhm.
She did get out. She
Gotcha.
lived on the side that didn't collapse. And my first thought, and I actually said this to her, I said, that's impossible. Can't
Or
happen.
you said when she told you about the collapse, you told her that's impossible?
Yeah, it can't happen. We talked for a couple minutes, and she was in a lot of distress. And Jean is a very strong woman, and I have never heard her that emotional. And all I could think of was, I've got to get there. It's a 12-minute or 12-mile drive there. Normally it takes me about 20 to 30 minutes. I made it less than 10. There was 2 fire trucks there, and the police had already started to cordon off the area. When I first parked, they're like, you can't go up there.
So there were just 2 fire trucks there when
Correct.
you got there. So they got there pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's a fire station just down the block.
Ah, got you.
So, I mean, you're talking about something that woke up half-mile radius.
Mm-hmm.
The officer that actually was talking to me, I explained to him who I was, and he called the battalion chief, acting chief at the site,
Mm-hmm.
and she's like, yes, get him over here. I happened to meet the town
Over to the collapse site?
correct.
Okay.
I was probably 2 blocks off.
You were 2 blocks, you were asked to stay away originally.
Yes, well, it was a police barricade.
Gotcha.
They weren't allowing people in.
Gotcha.
So I actually went up to the fire truck, and the building official for the town of Surfside was there, which I knew, because he was actually new to the town.
Mm-hmm.
He and I had actually been on the roof of the building because we were redoing the roofs the night before.
The very night before.
Correct.
Wow.
Probably about 6 o'clock that evening.
He must have been incredulous too.
He couldn't believe what happened. One of the first things is the garage is filling up with water. It's like, did you shut down the water mains? No. Where do you do that at?
Mm.
We went over to the valves, tried turning them, they were seized. So it's like, hey Jim, can you call and get us a church key, to turn it off at the street? Within probably less than a minute, Public Works was already there turning the water off. FPNL wasn't sure where the main disconnects were.
FPNL is Florida Power and Light?
Correct.
Okay.
Because normally they would shut it down for the vault room, which was in the building. Unfortunately, back again when this building was built, the records are a little sketchy.
They didn't save all the records from the construction of the building?
No building ever does. So it's like the manhole's right there in the street.
Mhm.
There has to be a disconnect.
And we're talking about the disconnect to the electric.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Again, you have water poured into a garage at that point. Again, you have two 8 to 12-inch main lines pouring thousands of gallons of water into the building, into the basement. So it's basically a giant swimming pool.
Mm-hmm. Which could cause fire. And,
Correct.
yeah.
And not safe for the firemen or anyone else.
Were they able to locate the shutoff?
Oh, yeah.
Electrical?
Yes. Yeah, it was just seeing the building itself was, I'll never forget it. Actually had to walk around with the fire department with search and rescue, explain to them different things where they were at. Luckily, I had all the blueprints digitized. So we were able to send them copies of them so they knew where bedrooms were at and how the units lined up and unit numbers, and which they said saved them an enormous amount of time. We walked actually down to the garage, which was under the uncollapsed side. Actually, the engineer that we had that had done the estimates for the bids and everything actually came down from West Palm, and he was actually helping to get them to understand the shoring needed to help keep them safe.
The existing building.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Because
Because I guess that was a huge fear, was that would collapse too.
correct. Supposedly, what helped save it was the fact that it was built a little bit differently. The columns underneath were a little bit more hefty, and there was a shear wall. The other side only had a partial shear wall, which adds rigidity to the building, and I mean that's what saved it.
Sure.
You know, the elevator shafts and the shear wall. Yeah, from then it just kind of turned to a whirlwind. Was pulled in by the police department, and
That night
in the morning, yes,
in the morning.
yes. Again, everything was was under suspicion.
Sure.
We didn't know if somebody had exploded the building, or
Well, that
what
was
had
a
gone.
main concern.
That was one of
That
the first
they
concerns.
thought that the building had been detonated
Correct.
device.
We actually had some dignitaries that lived there from other countries,
Hmm.
or their sister of. So they thought maybe it was retaliation.
Wow.
We had bomb sniffing dogs. We had um, people getting their hands swabbed for explosive residues, and
Really?
oh yeah, it was quite a show.
And so Homeland Security was there?
Everybody was there. Homeland Security, FBI, every city within probably a 20 to 30-mile radius.
Every city's building department,
Florida
Power and Light,
Yeah,
all the utilities,
everybody.
but the FBI and Homeland Security
Yeah.
must have been running the show, I guess.
No,
No. Who was in charge of the site?
Miami-Dade.
Uh,
Once it was immediately determined that there was no evidence of terrorism, Homeland and FBI kind of backed off. They were there for advice capabilities only.
And that was within a day or two, or
That was
week?
within a few hours.
Few hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
They moved quite quickly.
Wow.
Miami-Dade took over, and all I remember is bouncing from trailer to trailer to trailer. Between questions and between the police department and the fire department.
Mm-hmm.
Within 12 hours of it actually happened, I actually had gotten emails and phone calls from what we call DPPR, which is the Department of Professional Business Regulations.
DPPR.
Yeah. They regulate the license for the managers in the state of Florida, demanding records.
And you got that call within 12 hours
Yes.
of the collapse.
Yes. Threatening to have my license revoked if I didn't comply.
Well, I guess you sent them the blueprints.
I sent them nothing.
Oh, you didn't.
I, excuse the expression, told them that they need to be a little bit more sensitive. Here's our attorney. Talk to them.
Mm. Oh, they were demanding from the association.
Yes.
And from you.
Well, I was the agent of the association.
Gotcha.
I represent the building. If you're a police officer and you don't have a warrant, you come into the building, you're powerless. I invite you into the building and ask you to take action. I'm an agent for the building and all the residents. I can give you that because I represent the owner.
That's an awfully quick request for documents.
Yes.
Uh,
Either
Um,
someone was being nosy or they were trying
yeah.
to keep their.
wait, and the night that you got there, did you see Jean there?
Yes.
And was she sequestered off to the side too originally? Did
No.
she walk around with you?
No. She was in shock.
She was in shock.
She was actually sitting on one of the curbs with her family and shaking and
Shock.
didn't even have shoes on.
Yeah.
A lot of the residents didn't. That was one of the other good things is I actually called my security captain who knew basically everybody in the building, and we started directing people down to the community center and made that the rally point.
The rally point for seeing who was there.
Accountability, yes.
Accountability.
Again, being that most of our records were electronic, we were able to provide a residence list almost immediately. That's why at first you saw that it was 239 people or something like that. Well, it's because we don't know who's coming and going.
Yeah, because I know most high-rise buildings, they perform fire drills in case there's a fire or an earthquake in California.
Supposed to, yes.
You're supposed to. And, I know in California it's problematic because sometimes you just can't get people to do it. So it's
They
just
won't
a
do it.
perfunctory exercise with management and the board and staff. But in this case, with no building, that had to be a very uncomfortable exercise, taking count of everyone.
Yes.
Boy.
Again, that's where I have to commend Town of Surfside and the Red Cross because they're the ones that immediately opened up the center for us.
I see.
Red Cross started trying to help with accountability. Miami-Dade stepped up with trying to help because we all needed to know who was left in the building. There may have been survivors.
Yeah, I think that was the whole focus for the first 3, 4, 5 days.
Yes.
I remember seeing it on TV. Very tragic. Thank you so much, Scott, for sharing this with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. We'll go on to the second section here shortly.
Okay.